Well, hey there team, welcome back to the channel. Welcome to my review of Satisfactory 1.0. So I did an overview a few days back. It's where I just have a look at the first 2 hours of a game. It's very sort of early going, first impressions, taste tests, figure out if a game's for you or not, which anyone can do in 2 hours. And when I get around to reviewing a game, I only really have one objective standard, which is to say for every $5 Australian that I give a game, I expect that it gives me an hour of good gameplay fun. Now, it's a low bar intentionally, and it's not going to be for everyone. We've talked about this ad nauseum. And in this game, because this game is kind of designed for the grind, suffice to say, with the 12 hours I've put in against the $60 price tag, I barely scratched the surface. In previous years, in previous versions, I've played a lot more, but it's one of those things. It's kind of good to just compare, contrast, and give people an idea, because I do know that my audience skews a bit more to old boys with very limited hours and, honestly, kind of more willing to just pay a premium for a good game as opposed to trying too hard to get value out. So yeah, there's probably 1,000 hours of gameplay in here. I'm still in what you would call tier 2. It's sort of a world state that dictates the sub-research projects, and I keep getting distracted because the game, even though it's very familiar, it's almost nostalgia retreading all this. It's kind of cool to, Dear Diary, map out my progress and have a chat about it, because it illustrates that the real core thing about Satisfactory, more than almost any game I can think of, is it's very apparent that it's built by people that love this genre. Now, that might seem like a no-brainer, but do you have a job where you dig holes because you love digging holes, or because that just happens to be the job that you picked up and you've stuck with it, and so on, right? Game devs are the same for the most part. They're accomplished, and I'm not trying to take that away. They're very good coders and great at, building environments and so on and so forth. But often they're doing the job because that's the job that they're doing. It's not necessarily their love, right? And I find, because there is a creative component to these sort of games, or games in general, I find that seeps through and you can feel it. And what I feel playing this in its design philosophy is that it is designed by people that live and breathe these sort of games. Factory building, grinding type things, to the point where you're constantly going to become comfortable in some sort of system, your own idiosyncratic methodology for building a chunk of factory to an efficiency quota that you in your mind have come up with, and the game will, I don't want to use terms like move the goalposts or be subversive, because it never feels like that, because those things kind of infer a maliciousness to that behavior, and that's not what this is at all. I would argue it's perfectly paced to kind of realize that by the time you're just about comfortable with whatever you're doing, the game will introduce new angles, new mechanics, new things, and it's not just, plus 1,000 hours of grinding this thing. It will be some new mechanic that kind of rocks your little world that you've built, and then all of a sudden you're re-optimizing, rebuilding your factory, coming up with new ideas. It very much stimulates that part of your brain that wants to engage with yet another new an interesting optimization problem. So that's not supposed to be a cop-out carry water. I'm on tier 2. I can't remember how many tiers there are, and they have subcategory milestones, and the milestone tier system in and of itself is actually a brilliant example of the design that I'm talking about. So let's break that down actually real quickly. So within a tier, you have milestones. And so milestones are these sort of mini objectives, but in the early going, they're your main objectives, but it'll be like, get X copper wire, get 500 spools of copper wire and put it in the slot and press go, right? Now, I would call this bulk objective, or, I don't necessarily have an offhand terminology for it, but the concept is cashing in a resource in bulk. And I feel like everyone's going to find their own path to it, but you're probably going to recognize that if you set up a production chain for the copper spool wire, for example, you can fire and forget. You can slap a storage container on the end of it that can hold relatively, at this time in the game, infinite amount of copper wire. And as long as your factory just keeps powering along, you're going to essentially hit that quota. And there'll be a couple of different things within the milestone. So maybe you need to get iron plates as well. So you've set up the copper wire, fire and forget, go make the metal plates, and by the time you finish making the metal plates mini factory, you'll go back to the copper spool and it will have been filled up with the quota. Pick it up, cash it in. And this is how milestones are essentially done. I think I can broadly speak by most people. But then the tier system starts to really become apparent, which is to say that's about throughput imposed against bulk milestones. Essentially much bigger goals of much more complex mechanisms, and the only real way that you're going to get there is to essentially build a throughput line onto the space elevator that you're always trying to upgrade, optimize, build upon, and create a higher throughput, just because of the nature of it and the nature of how the next milestone will tumble into that as well. Anyway, so the long example and the point of that is that you will go, okay, well look, this is how I'm going to min-max my copper thing, and I'm going to build my buffer and that sort of thing. And then you've done that for about 5 little mini factories, and by the time you're sort of comfortable with that, the game kind of tells you, all right, it's sort of time to pivot and create these monster throughput lines into the space elevator and shake up the way you do things. Another great example is how power works, at least in the early game. So talking about bottlenecks, you'll create your own system, little buffers. I've got my own solution where I actually have a 50-50 peel on the end of a factory line. So reference before, maybe you make copper spool and you put it into a box at the end. Mine actually splits and goes into the world sync machine, which basically cashes things out to a fiat currency. I wasn't sure if it was still in the game or what have you, but it is, and I've unlocked it. And so, okay, yes, my copper spool is producing at 50% efficiency, arguably, because the other 50% splitting straight into the cash machine. But ultimately, that spool box is going to fill up eventually, and then what happens to your factory then? It stops. So at least having that 50 peel, it creates an overflow. It's sort of a bucket if you were filling a glass up from water that will catch anything when the water glass fills up to 100%. And that would go the same for the spiel storage. So once that hits 100, everything just goes straight into the bin and the factory just never stops. And again, cool solution, very happy with it if you can afford the efficiency hit, but it doesn't quite work so well when you're dealing with the milestone system. Anyway, I just thought I'd share that just as an example of my own eclectic nonsense thing that I came up with that kind of got a bit undermined by the moving of the goalposts. But even in that example, the big boogeyman is power, because if the factory shorts a fuse and stops, well, that whole thing stops, and then arguably it undermines my entire system anyway. If I'm trying to create a perpetual factory that doesn't stop no matter what, power becomes a very significant problem. So in the early going, you're essentially picking up twigs and sticks and shit like that off the ground and putting them in a power generator. And then as that goes along, you'll learn recipes to compact it by hand, essentially into biofuel. And in turn, you can put that through a recipe machine. So you can sort of create this sort of feedback loop where you dump a bunch of leaves in a storage container and that feeds in and compresses it and compounds it into a fuel-powered fuel-making machine. Combine that with the fact that your factory's power requirement is just going to essentially infinitely grow. Anyone knows this, and you're limited by the fact that your radius that you are picking up shit from your base is ever expanding, and now you're on a collision course for disaster. And that's probably one of the really early things that people, once they reconcile the storage bulk milestone kind of gameplay design, they will come to realize power's a problem. Power is on an intercept course for an unsustainable factory. You sort of have a doom timer, to be honest, especially if you're automating like crazy early. So then coal power gets introduced, which essentially taps an infinite vein, and it introduces water and water head pressure. And all of a sudden you now have a new power source that you do have to really go outside of your starting biome comfort zone to get going. But once you do, and you keep an eye on that, now you've essentially got infinite fuel. You can check fuse boxes and make sure that your power total output never really exceeds the power requirements of the factory. Or sorry, vice versa, I guess you understand. Because even though that's a cool mechanic and that whole mini loop is very clever and considered, if you don't really have a buffer, even with like waterhead pressure, like you probably want a float of water to keep your pipes all full, you will find unique situations pop up where you throw a fuse on the network, but you don't have coal backed up, and all of a sudden it's like having to hand crank start the factory. Do you disconnect half the cables? Do you build more biofuel? Do you have a miniature power starter motor, as it were, like a miniature factory with biofuel there to flick the switch if you need to unfuck overtaxing your coal supply? Because, like, for example, I have a half a kilometer long belt running fuel into the generator, and by the time that the generator would run out of fuel, or you throw a switch or what have you, you've already got a problem that's kind of unsolvable in the current build, because you've now got a half a kilometer of empty belt that you didn't know was there. It was the factory is accidentally running on fumes. Anyway, these are just anecdotal examples that you will face playing this game and have to overcome, and it's going to do it for another 1,000 hours as well, I have no doubt. But all of those things are not fluke, they're not happenstance. Like, I was allowed the freedom to find my solution and my way through it, but those sort of design principles go beyond the ability to write clean code or make pretty textures. That is from the mind of someone that loves this genre and understands what players, you and me, what us bloody spaghetti tin cavemen want from this space. And so look, that's my strongest pitch on the argument of, reviewing this and if it's worth your time, worth your money. It absolutely is, because it's made by people that aren't just passionate, because passion is no good without competence, but definitely there's competence here. Whoever it is, whoever's running the studio, if it's a brains trust, if they've got a flat hierarchy and everyone gets a say, I assume that they have actually a really healthy working environment to be able to get to this place, and it's composed probably almost exclusively of people that once they log out of work, they probably unironically play this more on their downtime, and you can feel it in the design. Anyway, it's brilliant. I'm going to try and get more time into it as I go along. Again, I don't pretend to be one of these channels that Satisfactory is their brand and that you play 10 billion hours of it. They're out there, you should look for them, and generally speaking, it's a pretty positive community from what I understand. But from one just idiot normie to another, if this sort of genre interests you even remotely, it is an absolute no-brainer to pick this up. Anyway, team, much as leave it there for the time being. I'll catch you guys on the next one.